So, I guess we can spend a couple, if I can get the words out of my mouth. We could spend a couple minutes. How did last week go for you guys, as far as teaching?
I introduced the discussion about monuments.
Sure.
Right after the closing bell rang. We did not actually get to discuss it.
That's fine.
Well, we had a good discussion.
Sure. That's good.
We spent a little bit of time talking about verse 5, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things among you. And did a comparison and contrast between the Red Sea crossing versus the crossing of the Jordan.
Sure.
Just the difference between those two, where the crossing of the Red Sea was more of a symbolic of salvation and deliverance from evil, and crossing of the Jordan was more a symbol of God's providence and provision.
Yeah. Chaz, Robert, what about your classes?
What was the question?
How'd your classes go last week?
They're good.
How's the teacher?
Teacher's fantastic. Teaching's been fantastic, yeah. As long as they don't ever talk, it's great. No, you talked about the, memorial sign, just passing on what we pass on to our kids and being intentional about that stuff is oh so ever present. I mean, like that is, when you hear stats like parents spend 2.5 minutes in meaningful conversation with their kids a day, that's a stark reminder to talk to your kids. You don't have them very long. Talk to your kids. So that was
Bergan. Zach, I'll ask you, even though I know you didn't teach last week. How'd torchbearers go last week?
Lots of crying. Because Perry talked. No, it was good. But Perry's also a little scattered at times, so I talked about a lot of different stuff, but no, I thought it was good. I had missed the week before, so I was a little bit out of the loop, so, but it was good.
Yeah. All right. I just want to, get more in the habit of checking in with you guys before just jumping into our lessons. Especially since we have an Old Testament section this quarter, and the Old Testament can kind of get unruly at times, especially depending on what rabbit holes your classes want to go down. And those rabbit holes are so enticing at times. Even this week I had rabbit holes I was trying to keep myself from going down because it's not really important to what our lesson is this week. But this week, I think the main focus that or at least the one that I highlighted, is this idea of obedience. And I kind of gave a spiel about how in our modern culture, obedience is kind of a dirty word now, because it's always the individual. Why should I listen to someone else's ideas? I need to focus on my ideas. My ideas are better. My truth is better. My opinion, my rights. It's never. We've lost the idea of community and obeying what others have asked us to do, or a standard. We even kind of talked about this last quarter in Galatians with this idea of what is freedom. And so if we want to, we can make that kind of pull back into this semester or quarter, whatever we're breaking up our classes with. Pulling that back because Galatians, I know we talked about it quite a bit in here, and I'm sure some of our classes got into kind of the similar conversations we had about what does freedom that Christ gives us look like. Well, we at least in here, identified we are free not so that we can do whatever we want, but so that we can more fully obey and follow Christ and follow God. Well, the Israelites are kind of having the same issue, except instead of having it 2 or 3 links down the chain, they're in that first little chain of what does it mean to follow God when God's saying some things that we're going to destroy a city by walking around it? How do I obey God? Because yes, he did bring me out of slavery in Egypt, and we did wander in wilderness. But it's the dilemma of can I or should I or will I obey what God has for us? And so I have a few questions that you may or may not want to throw out at the beginning of your class of what does it look like to be obedient to God, and do we follow God's instructions, God's will, or do we follow our own instructions or our own will? And again, you can use those or not, but that's kind of how I've mapped out our introduction. And then we'll go ahead and jump into the text. Would someone like to read chapter 5, verses 1 through 9 to get us started?
Now when all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings along the coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan before the Israelites until we had crossed over, their hearts melted, and they no longer had the courage to face the Israelites. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelites at Gibeah Haraloth. Now this is why he did so. All those who came out of Egypt, all the men of military age, died in the desert on the way after leaving Egypt. All the people that came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the desert during the journey from Egypt had not. The Israelites had moved about in the desert 40 years until all the men who were of military age when they left Egypt had died, since they had not obeyed the Lord. For the Lord had sworn to them that they would not see the land that he had solemnly promised their fathers to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So he raised up their sons in their place, and these were the ones Joshua circumcised. They were still uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. And after the whole nation had been circumcised, they remained there where they were in camp until they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you." So the place has been called Gilgal to this day.
All right, thank you. Why don't we just open up? What stood out to you guys? I know this is a weird section. Go ahead.
I think one of the things that stuck out as I just was looking, I think culturally, they do a way better job than we do. Everything has significance. The Gibeah Haraloth means Hill of the Foreskins. Dad, why do we call this place Hill of the Foreskins? And then you tell them the story. Why is this place called Gilgal? Because they rolled away they're able to tell a story. Why do we call this place Lubbock? I don't know. Yeah, you just don't. They did a better job of you're telling your story through places and times and settings and all the things. Everything matters, and we don't have as much of. That's not built into our culture as much. Sure. We have some of that, why is the flag at half-staff? Why, we have some of that built in, but it's not near as prevalent in our day-to-day where those guys, why are you wearing that box on your head? Well, scriptures, they had it built into the rhythm. We don't do that well. I just thought that was cool.
I think the timing's off.
Mm.
You'd think they'd circumcise them before they crossed the Jordan,
Yeah.
you know, before you get into enemy territory.
Yeah, it's a bold strategy.
One with the consecration part from the last chapter. 2 chapters
I
now.
guess they didn't consecrate well enough.
Yeah.
But there's some interesting, you know, it's like there's some obedience to this. It's like, hey, we're going to take all of our fighting men and everybody, and we're going to circumcise everybody and be really vulnerable for. I don't want to know how long it takes me to recover from that.
From a flint shaving.
Yeah, I feel.
Minimum of 3 days.
Yeah. I feel like my recovery
So
time
you'll
is
sign
gonna be
it
at least
this
a week.
Yeah.
Sir, I'm gonna need an extra 4 days here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, it teaches them to trust because they have crossed over. But, you know, from a human standpoint, you're like, why would they wait until now to do that?
Sure. Chapter 5 seems out of order for a lot of things. We'll get we'll get to this point later in the chapter, but the commander of the Lord's army appearing, several say, well, that's kind of like Joshua's burning bush moment, right? And then you have to look into this thing. Well, the burning bush happened before everything Moses did. Well, most of it. But it's at the beginning of the actual story, not in the middle of, we're already on our way to Egypt, or we're out of Egypt and then the burning bush happens. No, it's the thing that kicks everything off. And so I think there are several things about chapter 5 that seem out of order. And so, yeah. What else? What else stood out to you guys in this passage? If not, I can just read off what I wrote.
Again, one of the things I do when I teach Joshua is I'm always looking for Jesus. And this idea of Jesus being born as a baby, very vulnerable.
Sure.
Not the typical way we would send somebody in to save the world. Again, from our standpoint, our viewpoint. And so I see something kind of connected with this and that he came vulnerable as well in the midst of the enemy. It shows trust.
Sure.
And Jesus is, you know, there's the prophecy, out of Egypt I've called my son, you know, and there's a reference here. Those that came out of Egypt, you know, it's that same phrasing. There's that reminder that even the New Testament authors are going to go back to.
Mm-hmm.
Out of Egypt he called his people, his chosen people. Well, out of Egypt he is called Jesus. So I think you can play that a lot of different ways.
One of the things that I pointed out in our class, you know, when they crossed the Red Sea, scriptures tell us that it was viewed as baptism.
Mm-hmm.
And so I carried that forward to them crossing the Jordan River. This was a new generation crossing a new body of water. And so these people went in, crossed the Jordan. If you want to use the metaphor, baptism, they come out new people.
Mm-hmm.
And you carry that on forward into the New Testament, that after we have accepted Jesus and have obeyed, we go through this circumcision of heart in order to get ourselves right. That's not something that an unsaved person's going to do.
Mm.
Because they don't understand yet. They haven't learned enough. They also haven't developed that far in their faith. So to me, this is, again, when you start looking at this whole thing, why were they afterwards? Maybe God was just wanting to make sure they really were. Are you really my children or not? Now that you have proven you will do what I say, prove it to me. Make yourself mark yourself as being my children. I don't know, I'm just throwing that out as
Well,
an
that's true,
idea.
because everything that happens in Joshua, basically God does.
Yeah.
Here, this one, he's making them do.
Yeah. And it was their side of, okay, we do belong to you, but it was after they had proven that they would follow his word. Because up to that point, they had, this was the first test of them following his word. Other than that, all they've done is wander around the desert. You know, so they finally have obeyed him, proved it, so now it's, you know,
Sure.
circumcise yourself, the symbol of the covenant. Get your covenant right.
Why haven't they, you might know, why they are not circumcised?
Well, it says they weren't circumcised because they were born in the desert.
Well, and the generation who died off didn't follow the word of God.
Yeah.
So if they're not going to follow God, why would they follow the circumcision?
They may not have been circumcised in Egypt after a period of time. It may have just become one of those things where it's,
Some
that's what
were,
people
some
used to
weren't.
do, and
There's that
it's
weird,
like your Passover, it's,
so there's that weird story with Moses and Zipporah. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously he was not until later. You would think that he would make it a point of emphasis. Well, I don't know. Obviously he didn't, but it seems like it would be a point of emphasis if,
well, as a Jew, he should have been circumcised by the 8th day.
yes.
And
Yeah.
he was probably about 3 months old when he was put into the river. Of course, they did know it was an Israelite baby, so maybe it's because he was circumcised, but if we have that story later,
And then you get in the whole debate. Sorry, I wrote a paper about this because I asked for help and someone said, well, here, how about this passage? And so, thanks was my whole response. But then you get the whole idea of, well, is it actually Moses' foreskin or that's being circumcised, or his son, who's probably 30 or 40 at this time, who's also now getting circumcised, just as all these men who are now in Joshua getting circumcised as adult males. And
You're talking about when God is ready to kill Moses?
yeah,
Yeah.
which, yeah,
Gotcha.
it's a weird idea.
Hard to translate, hard to interpret. It's
Yeah.
it's not easy. You would think at some point in time in this desert wandering that Moses would have got the clue that everybody needs to. Otherwise, the point is now you're at chapter 5. You know, you're at
Sure.
you're on the West Bank, and it's part of the cleansing and, you know, setting the table. Yes, you've forgotten, but he doesn't have to re-explain circumcision. They
well,
know what it
maybe that's
is.
what the reproach of Egypt is that they quit doing it because they were in Egypt. And so circumcision was rolling away that reproach of something they carried over with them from Egypt.
Passed through the water, and now you're rolling away the approach of. Guess it fits there.
I mean, if we take the baptism analogy, once we're baptized, there's those American reproaches, I guess, that we have to kind of put away because we are no longer able to do the same thing that Steve, the unbaptized, non-believing American, can do versus I, now a baptized believer of the kingdom of God. I can no longer participate in everything Steve does because, well, Steve's doing things that God clearly commands against or has expectations for us to do the opposite. And so, I think it's the same idea of, well, you fell into the habit of doing things like the Egyptians, and now you've come through this new land and you've been consecrated yourself, but now you have to put away all of that old stuff because you're not Egyptians, you're Israelites. You're not living in a foreign land and living as not the foreigners, what would they be called? The citizens do in their own country. You're now expected to live as Israelites in the land of Israel. And so, yeah. What else? What else stood out in this section? And if nothing else, we can go ahead and move on. But- All right, I'll go ahead and read chapters, not chapters 10 through 12, verses 10 through 12 of chapter 5, if you want to follow along. While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening on the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. Sorry for taking the short portion from you guys. It's clearly something, this passage is clearly something that someone wanted to have written down because they wrote it down. For what reason, we can tirelessly debate it till we're blue in the face. And I don't think we'd be any closer than we are probably right now to understanding why it's in there. But it is interesting. They consecrated themselves in last week's portion. Now they have crossed through the Jordan, and now they have been circumcised, and now they're taking of the Passover in the land. All before they even set off towards Jericho. But it is, I don't know what thoughts you guys have. I really just wrote questions and put it down in the handout, so I don't know if any of those will help. But it is interesting that at this time, we're also no longer receiving manna from God, because you have come into the land. You've at least taken possession of Gilgal, so that you are eating of the fruits and produce of the land. What else do you guys see happening in this section?
I just keep thinking, because I'm also going through the story in my small group, so I'm a little bit ahead. Like I've been kind of going through Joshua at the same time as this, but God is important to them now. Mm-hmm. They're following. They're, you know what I mean? Like they're starting a relationship with Him. It's who they are. You know what I mean? It's like their identity is becoming what God wants them to be in these early parts of Joshua, and He's going to show them, well, if you'll follow me, this is what I'll do for you. You know what I mean? And all of this is the beginning of that story. You know, and even to the point of, you know, I brought you food now. I don't, you know, the 40 years of freebies is over, right? Like, I mean, all of this is their obedience, and He's led them to this place, and they're reciprocating with faith at this point. And it's about to turn into Jericho. I mean, we're about to head into all these cool stories of the Bible, but I just see it as the beginning part of this amazing faith journey that they're on. Sure.
Well, it does show that God is in control. The manna wasn't just some phenomenon that happened and then eventually died down. It literally stopped the day they were in the land where food was available.
Yeah.
I don't remember this part, so help me remember, because the manna was part of it, was also the pillar of light. I mean, there was all those things that God was doing for them. When did all that stop? You know what I'm talking about? Like, when was that?
Cloud by day.
Yeah, was this before? It had to be before this, right?
That's why I was leading them through the desert. So they've kind of got out of the desert with Moses on the edge, because then they had to take over some cities.
Yeah.
So it never really says when it.
That's what I'm thinking too, because in my mind I kind of put all that together. Like, it was like, look at all these things God's doing for you, and you still don't believe in Him. And then I don't remember them saying that ended at that point too.
It lasted as long as they needed it, I'm guessing.
Took them to the Jordan River. You know what I mean, or whatever, probably.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is not based on anything, or it was just kind of what I had stuck in my head. But I thought the cloud and the pillar of light or fire was to get them to Sinai. And then after then, Moses was, because they get to the promised land pretty quick after Sinai, because they get there at least to send spies out, and then they're like, no, we're not going into the land, and then God says, oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not trying to sidetrack us, but there was just so many amazing things God was doing, including manna, but all those other things too.
Cloud tend to seemed after that point to be associated with the ark.
Sure.
It inhabited the tabernacle once the ark was put in there.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to move on if anyone else has anything else, but if not, we can jump to the more exciting portions of this week's lesson. Someone like to read verses 13 through 15.
Ooh, the next one's chapter 6. I'll do 13 through 15. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." And Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did so.
All right. Before we open it up for discussion, I have to say this. We can debate this and have actually pretty solid evidence for its different arguments and jump all across Scripture, finding passages that support one view or the other, about who the commander of the Lord's army is, whether it's just some angel, whether it's the pre-incarnate Christ, whether it's this or that. And this was the rabbit hole I had to stop myself from going down this morning when I was writing this. That's not really what we're talking about here, at least in this week. It is a good mental exercise to kind of jump through all these different passages and see how it's connected. Because one, as I already mentioned, I think it sounds like Moses in the burning bush because it's supposed to sound like Moses in the burning bush. But then you start jumping through all these other Old Testament stories and you start to see, well, this didn't just happen twice, it happened over and over and over again. And then you can start making arguments, comparing them and saying it's all happening in the same way. And we could talk about this for hours, but we don't necessarily have hours on Sunday morning. And we could even then get into the argument of, as you start to read chapter 6, well, what does it mean? Are these instructions coming at the same time as the angel of the Lord's there? Is it different? Is it the same time? Is it a different point? Is it two different people talking? Again, those discussions, while they are good, and it's good to stretch those muscles from time to time, isn't really the focus of this morning's, or not this morning's, Sunday morning's lesson. Because really we need to get into the meat of chapter 6 of 1, Joshua, you're asking us to just walk around the city for a whole week. And then we're not going to actually go up to fight this fortified city. We're just going to yell at it on the 7th day. We're supposed to be bringing priests into this battle. Well, sure, it was fine when it was just Moses, but you want us to bring the ark and people who don't have swords, but just horns? Like, what does that look like? And that kind of leads us into that discussion about obedience some more. But I also don't want us to not get the chance to talk about this section. If there's something we need to address here. So, is there anything you guys want to talk about here?
What I see in that is this figure doesn't say I'm for you or against you, or not for your enemies either.
Sure.
It says I'm for God.
Mm-hmm.
And what I take from that is, sometimes we get caught up in asking God to bless our plans as opposed to asking God to help us see what His plans are for us.
Sure.
The direction that He wants us to go. And so recognizing that it's not the Israelites' way or the Canaanites' way, it's God's way. And And Joshua and the people need to see what they can do to be walking in God's way and following his way.
Yeah.
Because Bergan emphasizes that obedience to God and what his call is.
I think the thing that I see here, and this came out in our study we had in small group, is the army, the commander is not saying for you, what he's saying to them is, are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
That's a different conversation. It's like, I'm the commander of God's army. Like, I'm not for either anybody. Like, I think that's why it turns into, you need to take a shoot. You know what I mean? It's like, are you with me or not? I think that's what's important here. And I think there's a pretty valuable lesson in all of that. Like y'all were talking about, like decision making or whatever it is are you with me?
The assurance that it gives Joshua, because we tend to forget this part of the story when we get to chapter 6. But that phrase, as commander of the Lord's army, I'm now here. What does that mean? I'm going to tell you how to take over Jericho, but I'm here. And I brought, if he's the commander, he didn't come by himself.
There's an army with him.
And so we like to talk about, walk around Jericho and all that faith that it took and the walls fall. Well, yeah, because you got an entire army attacking it that nobody can see.
Sure.
And so it helps Joshua to be courageous and brave. I was just, not to go down the rabbit hole, but I was curious what word Joshua used. What message does my Lord have for you? Because it's not Yahweh, but he uses Adonai, which is only used for God. It's not a generic.
Sure.
And I'm sure there's a whole lot more. Chapter 5 should have been a whole lot longer.
The key is the very last phrase, and Joshua did so.
Yeah.
I think it's, Mike, to your point too, like the more God shows up to Joshua, the more he feels, I've got, God's on my side. I got this. Because Moses handed it down. You know what I mean? Because Joshua knows about God's interaction with Moses, right? So the more he shows up for Joshua, the more he's like, man, like this is what this is like. I think that's exactly right.
Because if a leader's not convinced when he's trying to lead the people, okay, we're going to march around.
Yeah.
Let's just try it, see what happens.
I'm sure nobody said under his authority, why are we marching around this? But if you can say, I just had an interesting meeting with the leader of Lord's army. Oh, gotcha, let's go. That's it. Yeah, it brings a lot to a leader when you've got the Lord on your side. So, yeah, that's good. Other than that, we didn't have anything Bergan. So, yeah.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and move into chapter 6. Would someone like to read the first 7 verses for us?
Now Jericho was tightly shut, because the sons of Israel, no one went out, no one came in. The Lord said to Joshua, see, I have given Jericho into your hand with its king and the valiant warriors. You shall march around the city, all the men of war, circling the city once. You shall do for 6 days. Also 7 priests shall carry 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark, and then on the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times. The priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall be that when they make a long blast in the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people will go up, every man straight ahead. So Joshua the son of Nun called the priest and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord. Then he said to the people, verse 7, right?
Yes.
Okay. Then he said to the people, go forward and march around the city, and let the armed men go on before the ark of the Lord.
All right. Anything stand out to you guys in these instructions? If not, we'll just move on.
Wow.
Not exactly how you attack an armed fortress.
Detailed plans right here. You got it. The nod to creation, like this is 6 days and the seventh day, and
Sure.
there's all the sevens. Just something, I mean, none of that is mistake. I mean, none of that is it's not coincidence. It's all on purpose. Do we fully grasp it? That's a different story. But the fact is like all that stuff's on purpose.
And we had the story of Rahab, so we already know how they're feeling, but it's cool how in verse 1 and 2, it's shut up. They won't let people in, they don't let people out. And God's response to that is, see? They're not going to get away. I've given them to you. They're there. So that's just kind of funny to me.
They've placed themselves in the barrel. Because looking
Their
ahead,
trust in the wall. That's
Yeah.
what they did.
well, eventually when Jerusalem's under siege, they fall under the same whole idea of, well, the walls of Jerusalem will protect us. Well, that's great, but the water source is outside the gates, and so we need, if we're wanting to stay in, we need to build a tunnel to get this water in, or you get the whole issue of, well, the walls will still protect us after we've built this tunnel and have the spring coming into the walls. Well, yeah, but now you're just stuck there. You can't go anywhere else. You've basically already put yourselves in chains to this idea of staying inside the city. And so, yeah, it is interesting. Jericho does the same thing. They've pulled everyone in, and you are stuck here, for better or for worse. But
It's fascinating to me that this is where we start to see the Ark of the Covenant play important roles, like pick it up and go to the Jordan, touch the wall. You know what I mean? Like the Ark plays big roles, and so I'm just trying to visualize that. If I'm on the opposite side, it's like, oh great, they brought the Ark. You know, like, but also like, I don't know how big Jericho was exactly. But I do know how much gold and how much stuff they put into the Ark to make that thing what it is. That was not a small group to carry. I mean, imagine the effort it took to carry that thing into, I mean, it had to be quite the
A couple
spectacle.
100 pounds.
Yeah, I mean, it's wild to think about the effort and the obedience, to your point. Like, it took just to say, we're going to carry the Ark around this thing all week long. We're going to do this just because they told us to.
and
It wasn't an
7
easy thing.
times in
Yeah.
one day.
Yeah, it was not an easy thing to do.
I read somewhere that it was maybe approximately 1.5 to 2 miles around. I mean, it wasn't huge, but even so,
When
you're not
the
talking
circumference.
about walking on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
You're talking walking on land that they purposely left full of rocks and
Yeah.
unevenness and everything else to keep invaders away.
And don't you dare drop that Ark or touch it. Yeah.
But day 7, you born it smooth, I hope.
Yeah. So all that just, the story is amazing, but to me, just watching them, the Ark starting to play into more and more of the story here.
Which then is fun because then you get further along in the story and the Ark gets taken because God lets it get taken. Because they're flashing it around like this.
Yep.
So,
But they're doing it on their own.
Yeah.
You know, that's the difference.
Yeah.
It's this is our get out of jail free card. Let's throw that thing into the battle and we'll win.
Yep.
And doesn't God says, you know what Paul says in Galatians, God will not be mocked. You know. I said you could carry it around. I said you could carry it around Jericho. I didn't say you could carry it around with the Philistines.
Yeah. Yeah, every time God tells them to carry it, I think it works out. It's pretty interesting.
Seems like it.
Yeah.
And it's carry it, don't put it on a cart.
Don't
Yeah,
put it on
exactly.
there.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's good.
All right, I'll go ahead and try and read through the rest of the chapter, and then we'll stop for discussion. Picking up in verse 8. And just as Joshua commanded the people, the 7 priests bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing trumpets with the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord following them. The armed men were walking before the priests who were blowing the trumpets, and the rear guard was walking after the Ark, while the trumpets blew continually. But Joshua commanded the people, "You shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither shall any word go out from your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout." So he caused the ark of the Lord to circle the city, going about it once. And they came into the camp and spent the night at camp. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. And the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord walked on, and they blew trumpets continually. And the armed men were walking before, and the rear guard was walking after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. And the second day they marched around the city once and returned into camp. So they did for 6 days. On the 7th day they rose early at the dawn of day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, and Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But you, keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when they have been devoted, you have devoted them to take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. But all the silver and gold and every vessel of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord, and they shall go into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. And as soon as the people heard the sounds of the trumpets, the people shouted a great shout, and the walls fell down flat. So that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. But to the 2 men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, "Go into the prostitute's house, and bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, and her father, and mother, and brother, and all who had belonged to her. And they brought all her relatives and put them outside of the camp of Israel. And they burned the city with fire, and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and of iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab, the prostitute, and her father's household, and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she lived in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua had sent to spy out Jericho. And Joshua set an oath on them at that time, saying, "Cursed before the Lord be the man who rises up and rebuilds the city of Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest son shall he set up its gates." So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all of the land. All right.
One of the things we studied talking about this story is it's interesting to think that the mission was to destroy Jericho, but you could almost say that the mission was to get Rahab out of there based on the lineage. You know what I mean? Like, it's an interesting thought when you think of it that way, because she's in the lineage of Jesus. You know, I know it was both, but just how vital, how important that is to the story. You know, it's not a coincidence, and it's very intentional what happens in this part of the story, because we see the rest of it. You know, that Rahab plays an important role in this whole thing. So it's just a different way to look at it, but still powerful. It's the other thing. It's always hard to think about, but it's a lot of people dying.
Yeah.
You know, and it's a lot of livestock, a lot of, you know what I mean? It's just a hard thing to think about. But we have to remember that these people, you know, they had an opportunity to serve God. They had you know what I mean? And this is God saying, you blew it. You know, like, they had an opportunity and they didn't do it. And so it's just hard when you get through these parts of the Bible. It's hard to think about how many hundreds or thousands of people were killed, but it's part of God's plan. But it's still hard to think about.
It's interesting though, because 1 Corinthians says in the past God forgave such ignorance, but now he commands people everywhere to repent. So maybe they're saved. But what about today? How many hundreds and thousands and millions are going to die spiritually because we don't go out and tell them?
Yep.
Mm. It's interesting. I don't know if I've ever noticed it, but in the lineage, Rahab marries a guy named Salmon, salmon fish, whatever.
Yeah.
But his lineage comes up in different places like Ruth and Chronicles and some other places. I don't know if I've ever actually noticed all of those ties he pops up in quite a few places. I do wonder, she just come in and like, Salmon's like, hey, I'll, kind of the kinsman redeemer kind of deal, like, hey, I'll take you in, or was Salmon one of the two spies and, it's like, hey, we had a good first impression.
You're a woman of your word.
Remember that time I rescued you?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, because guys are good at these pickup lines and stuff.
That's right.
Yeah.
You've got to be good if you're
I'd
named
march
to be
around the
Salmon.
city for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see any marching out there?
13 times.
Yeah.
He had the fireman entrance into the house. And
Yeah. I'll go get her.
Yeah, that's a discussion I've never heard before.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chase.
You're welcome. Do what I can. I do know, on a more serious note, I've heard, at least in recent years, there's new archaeology that even more and more confirms the, destruction of Jericho in this way, and how the walls had fallen, and just being able to, like pottery that's found inside of that kind of that level, but like I said, new or more recent archaeology that is confirming the biblical Jericho, which is cool to. It's not required, but it's fun to have.
yeah. It is also one of those things. Jericho is still a city now, and you could get to the whole, well, is the curse going to apply to these people too? And did it just happen to the construction crews that live there, or like, when did this curse happen? Which there are people who we have a record of in Kings who are cursed because they go up and they say, it's a great idea, let's rebuild Jericho. And they are cursed, and the curse is carried out. But it is one of those, I'm not going to be the one to say everyone who's living in Jericho is fine, but because I'm not the one who can make those judgments. But it is interesting, just kind of some of those patterns of, I think sometimes we forget that some of these places in the Bible are still actual places that people live in. And so it's not just an empty field where they're digging some of these places up. Usually they're digging things up because, hey, we need to build a new road. And then they start clearing the ground and they realize, oh, there's a house here. And you need to go back through and dig up all the houses. And it's kind of like Italy struggles with that around Rome, with building subways of well, we just need to build another subway tunnel, we'll be fine. And then they find more Roman architecture, and they're like, well, can't build a subway. And so these places have so much historical significance that sometimes the people who live there take it for granted. I think sometimes we take the historical significance for granted too, just because we think, well, that's in a book and it happened all those years ago, and so we don't need to actually think about what it is today, or realize that these are places that are real on a map. Kind of, as we've already kind of hit, and the pattern we're trying to do each week, which I still don't know if I like how I labeled it in the handout, but it's the choose this day who you will serve, kind of a comparison. It's, as we've talked about this week, we're focusing on obedience to God, and you get the whole idea of people are faced with a choice. They clearly all are obedient and make the right choice. But here in a couple of weeks, we'll start running into instances where they're making wrong choice after wrong choice, and yet they're still being asked, no, just follow God. And so this week, the choice they're faced with is, do I do this my way, or how I think it should go, or do I do what God has? And it goes back to that commander of the Lord's army. Are you for us or against us? And well, I'm for neither. I'm for God. And so it's kind of tying it all back together. We can talk about, have we ever chosen someone's leadership that led us away from God, that was against what God has asked? Have we ever had to face choices on who to be obedient to? But then again, we also get the same conclusion that we've had every week of, what are some of those things that are keeping us from obeying God, from following God, from choosing to follow God over, I guess, whatever we're not doing?
Well, you see in chapter 7.
Yeah, I was about to say.
We're
on our way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As soon as Jericho is destroyed, we've got people who have stolen some of the plunder. And so greed, something that gets in the way.
I was about to say the very next scripture, but the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. So many times throughout scripture, especially the Old Testament, like you read through Kings and all this, it's like, but the Israelite, but the, it's just like, oh, come on. Like it just feels like it starts a recurring theme before too long where it's like, this king was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Like right after, on the heels of an amazing, knock the walls down. The next chapter is, there's still some morons hanging out in that group,
Sure.
And their way to tarnish God's deliverance.
Yeah. My Bible takes me to 1 Kings. I know we don't have to cover this, but like 1 Kings 16:34 is where the first king, there's the king that tries to rebuild Jericho. Did y'all see that? Hiel of Bethel cost his laid his foundation on the cost of his firstborn son, and he set at the gates the cost of his youngest son, Segub. It's just interesting. So that does tie together still. It's good.
Well, that clock seems to be behind this week. Seemed to be ahead last week. Someone must have touched it, because I haven't touched it. But we have like a minute left before the bell. Does anyone want to have the last word? All right, thank you guys. Go and make it your own. And see you next Sunday, and then next week for another prep class. So, thank you.